Today on Curious Christianity, we are talking about young Earth creationism, and I am very excited to have Theo Apologetics or whatever basically on the channel. And so today we have several guys from their ministry. And if you guys wouldn't mind, how about you just introduce yourselves one at a time, and we'll get this conversation on young Earth creationism started.
Well, I'm Derek. Um, been doing apologetics for maybe since 2008. Unofficially, officially, doing my own studies and just basically a core apologist and theologian.
Cool deal. Why don't you go, Clark?
Yeah, I'm Clark. Derek and I started theologetics.org about 7-ish years ago. We met in Iraq. We were both deployed back in 2008, I think it was, and been keeping in touch ever since. And then we met Tim through Twitter. Was it like 4 or 5 years ago now, Tim?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah, and kind of teamed up with him to create our app, and kind of keep in touch and bounce ideas off of each other and come up with different tools and ideas to try and spread the news of Jesus and through apologetics usually.
Very cool. And your last, Tim.
So my name's Tim McCabe, and I'm a software developer by day and an amateur apologist all the rest of the time. And Clark and Derek have let me hang out with them and in the land of theologetics. It's been a lot of fun.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, one of the major things as well to me has just the excitement to be able to chat with all of you guys and other Christians about different beliefs, and to be able to be honest that we can have like a serious conversation about the Bible and what it says and not throw stones or anything like that. So, but I am curious, actually. Do all of you hold a young Earth view tentatively or strongly, or do you guys have diverging views on like Genesis 1?
Traditionally, yeah, I'm pretty strongly YEC.
Okay.
I'm open to other possibilities, but to me, it seems that the most faithful reading of the texts in Genesis and throughout the Bible seems to align with young Earth stance from my point of view.
I'm typically a young earther. There's some questions that I still have, and I guess I'm not as dogmatic as I used to be about the young Earth. Well, I would perhaps say I'm a staunch young earther. Maybe when it comes to the entire universe, maybe not so much. I think there might be some wiggle room for that.
Gotcha. Tim?
Yeah, I'm squarely in the young Earth camp. 6-day, 6K. That's how I would describe myself.
I don't think I've ever actually heard that one. Have you like written that down somewhere? Like, I'm surprised. I got to be honest. I'm really surprised that I've never heard that. Like, that's such a good catchphrase that, yeah. And so just for clarity, so look, I grew up in the young Earth camp. That was pretty much, most of my Christian career. So I have only very recently left that camp. So sorry, guys, but you didn't hand out enough s'mores and hot dogs. Yeah. So now my major thing about it is that I am much more concerned about, how we're interpreting the text rather than the subject of how old the earth is in a more literal sense. Right. And it's been my experience anyway, that's really what we're all concerned about anyway. Right. We're concerned about what does the Bible say and how does, my worldview, what I believe about the world and all those things line up with what the Bible says. Right. We all agree on that?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's only been for me, I definitely started to have some wonderings about it several years ago, but then it was literally just last week. Last week was probably my very first public profession of leaving the camp.
Wow.
Okay. So Yeah. Now, number one, I want to put forward absolutely the thing that it was not like mm, just like, oh, I felt like there was an abundance of scientific evidence that overwhelmed me, and that's why I converted. I would say that my major thing was that it seemed like the text didn't say as much, or it wasn't as specific about the age of the Earth as I originally thought. That would be my primary first thing. So now I know, Derek, you said that you had some questions you still wanted answered. So maybe we can start with you. I'm curious, like what kind of questions, out of curiosity? And I'm not sure, like if you guys want to ask me questions, by all means, yeah, feel free. But
Well, I was speaking with Clark a few days ago. That I believe there is, like I said, some wiggle room with the age of the universe.
mhm,
I believe it doesn't have to be 6,000 years old. I believe the Earth is maybe 10 to 6,000 years old. But I believe that um, when it said God created the heavens and earth, and the earth was without form and void, I'm not a expert by any means when it comes to the Hebrew language.
mhm,
But it seems from the way it's written, the tohu vabohu is that God took the chaos and then created order out of it.
mhm,
Um, basically, I use the analogy of someone taking 1,000-year-old bricks and creating a new house. Um, I believe there is some room for that.
mhm,
Um, and when we talk about the days, when God told Adam and Eve that the day you eat of the fruit, you will surely die.
mhm.
They did not die the day that they ate the fruit. They died, a few hundred years later. So I believe that, yeah, when God says day, or when the Bible says day, it doesn't have to literally be 24-hour days all the time. Now, when it says the morning and the day and the night, they were the first day. To me, that's a day. But I don't think we have to take that literally for each day.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? But yeah, those couple questions I have.
Gotcha, gotcha. Well, and I'll just tell you, actually, that verse in particular was probably the first major biblical verse that really started to move me anyway.
Hmm.
Was just Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. Because to me, it seemed like that talking about, like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was separate from day one, that's talking about afterwards. So, um, yeah, I'm not too sure. Let's see. So, let me ask you, I have a general question that I'm curious what you guys think. Now, because like what I said earlier, right? We all believe that the Bible really matters. So, like, the scientific consensus, in a sense, doesn't really matter, right? I just want to clarify because I want to focus on the biblical portion, I guess,
Right.
then. I mean, almost all the major guys I know, they just feel like it's like, well, look, if the Bible leaves things open, then we can talk about science. But if the Bible is pretty clear, then why are we talking about science? Does that sound about right?
Mm, I would say that no matter what camp you're in,
Hmm.
you're going to come at it with some assumptions to begin with. Science can't alone determine the age of the Earth
Hmm.
because you have to make various assumptions when you're looking at like different dating methods. So if you have, in one sense, you're right. Yeah, the text, if it's clear, then that's probably our best evidence. If it's really a literal interpretation, that's how it's hermeneutically written as a literal 6-day creation week, then I believe the evidence will align with that if you look at the evidence properly and scientifically. But I don't think alone science can even accurately
Hmm.
date the Earth or the universe without assumptions to begin with, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Yep. If they conflicted, right? Do you think that, yeah, well, kind of like what you were saying, right? They should align, right? Would we say that we feel like they should align?
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think they should.
Gotcha. Now, I'll ask this, and I don't mean this as like an unfair question, but would there be something that you know of, and it's okay if you don't, but would there be something you know of that if it changed, it would change your mind on the age of the Earth or something like that?
Possibly, but I can't really think of anything specifically.
Okay,
Me,
no
I don't know
worries.
about Tim or
So you said, is there something we know of?
Like, okay, so like, let me give you an example of what I'm thinking. Like, so, like if somebody had like in the past, right, definitively found Jesus's body, right? It was like, okay,
Mhm.
that would seem like it's like, all right, it's going to start to change my mind. Now,
Right.
obviously, look, I'm a Christian, so I don't believe any of that or any of the other possibilities are really
Right.
there. But right, that would be like an example of something that would begin to change my mind. Or so like for instance, for me, of course, if somebody could definitively show like a change in the genre of Genesis 1, right? Then that could sway my view on how I perceive the text. So I don't know. So like, okay, so I guess maybe I'll do it this way. I'll ask this question. Why do you think that day 2 isn't called good in Genesis 1?
God didn't create anything on day 2.
Okay. So, but what about day 1 and 3? Does he create anything on the first 3 days of creation? Or does he not create
1 and
anything
3 he
on,
does, yeah.
what's
Or
he create on day 3?
day 3.
Because he's just separating the waters, right?
Well, that's day 2, isn't it?
Now he separates the waters from below from the waters above, but day 3 he separates the waters from
Well,
the
in the beginning,
land.
God created the heavens and the earth.
Day
So,
3 is the vegetation.
mhm. So essentially, God is creating time, space, and matter on day 1, from my
Okay.
point of view.
So you take verses 1 and 2 to be part of day 1?
I mean, Hebrew wasn't written with the verse numbers originally. We're just,
Sure, sure.
they've been placed there much later. But yeah, I would say that's all part of day 1. Tim, you can interject if you feel I'm off.
Yeah, no, verse 5 seems to indicate that the time before the light was the evening, and the time with the light was the morning. And so you combine those two things, evening before light is created, and then morning after light is created, and you have your first day. So yeah, I would agree. Everything up to Genesis 1:5 through 1:5 is the first day.
Okay, so the days don't necessarily begin with and then God said, right?
I wouldn't see any reason to think that they do.
Well, because to me it seemed like there was like this pattern, right? So because to me there's this like pattern throughout Genesis. It's like the days seem to begin with like and God said, and then they like end with this evening and morning. Except all of the days except for day 7, right? Which also is so like the bookends are kind of different.
Mhm.
Hmm.
One of the, if I can go back to one of the other questions I have, it's when in Genesis 2, when God creates man, um, it said before God created him from the dust, basically before any vegetation. And then it said God placed him in Eden also before there was vegetation. So it sounds like when God created man, there was no vegetation anywhere, which of course, God created man on day 6, and God created the vegetation on day 3. So if day 3 comes before day 6, there will be vegetation before man. But in Genesis 2, it seems like there is Adam before vegetation. So that's just another question I have, which also makes me kind of question if the chronological, if the days are actually chronological or some other
Some other
order.
construction.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So I'm curious. So you would say, like, if we gave up young Earth creationism, what do we really lose? what's the biggest thing that we lose?
I think death and pain before sin, I think, is pretty huge to me.
Gotcha. Right. So the death question's like one of the biggest ones.
To me, the main thing that we would lose is the or how do I say this? Okay, let me start over. To me, the young Earth creationist perspective is the plain interpretation, my plain interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2. And so if we get rid of that, then I'm basically saying I don't know how to interpret Genesis 1 and 2. And since it's such a plain, to me, it's so plain. So obviously that's what it's saying. Now all of a sudden I don't have any idea what it's saying. And then I would have to ask, well, what about all of the other things that this book that I've been given, that I'm basing my life on, says? If I can't understand this, why would I think I could understand the other stuff? Especially when this seems to be pretty clear to me. I mean, it's one thing to say, this passage, I read it and I don't understand it.
Sure, sure.
But with Genesis 1, it's like, I feel like I read it and I do understand it. So,
and I think that's fine though. Because especially when I get to the prophets, I'm like, I have no idea what he's talking about. and
That's
I
still
think
the case for several
right.
points, yeah.
So I think in some cases that's fine if we say we because there are some things I used to be totally clear about and totally would argue for, and then I get to a point where I'm like, yeah, I don't think that way anymore. You come to a place where you're not sure, you're certain, then you're not sure, and then you're certain that you were wrong. So
Yeah.
and so yeah, I think that's totally fine too, especially Genesis 1, because I think the way it's written, we come to it with our Western preconceived notions about how things should be written. And I think that sometimes we can be wrong about the way scripture is written in some things.
So, see, for me, I guess, to me, when I read it more plainly, and this is actually, again, it's one of the things that to me brought me away from things, was that to me, it reads very plainly like, sure, I'll concede 6 days, right? But the more plain part would be that God creates before day one, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was void and formless. And this sounds like it's talking about the initial conditions when he begins the first day of 6 days. Like, is there like a particular reason that you don't find that to be plausible, or?
I think some of the New Testament descriptions of, like, I think in John, let's see, what is it? John 1 through 3 uses the term in the beginning. I think it's pretty safe to say that's referring to the same moment when all things were created. So if there's this time that God creates, and then there's a long period of time, and then there's day 1 and 2 and 3, and then man is created on day 6, but that's really not the beginning of creation. It's some, millions or billions of years before that. Then John 1 through 3 doesn't seem to make sense to me. If all things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came to being that has come into being. So, it seems like that would cause a big issue.
Well, to me, John 1 would simply be saying that, yeah, God created everything in the beginning.
But it wouldn't be the beginning then, right?
No, it would be the beginning of Genesis 1, right? Genesis 1:1.
But man's not created in the beginning, though.
That's right. That doesn't mean that man isn't
if it's
created.
talking about man being created in the beginning, but then you're saying the beginning is, hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years before that beginning, that's not at the beginning anymore.
Well, but either way, man's not created in the beginning as far as day 1 goes, right?
Well, if you're
Created on
looking
day
at
6.
the creation week as the beginning, that still makes sense as the beginning as compared to 6,000 years, right? Or back when Jesus was around, 4,000 years. So that would still be the beginning. But if you're saying, well, there's millions of years, then man's created, and then there's a few thousand years that's the end.
It could just be any time before day one, right? So like if you're, I mean, is the hang up on millions of years, or really it's just a matter of, is it associating that God's creating everything together, right?
I think the hang up would be what's the beginning mean? It loses its meaning if it's not truly that beginning, that creation week. If it's not a literal creation week, it would have to be. I mean, I guess you could say it could still be within 2,000 years, because that would still be on the other side of the middle. But you know what
I
I'm
believe
saying? Like I think you start to lose the meaning of certain phrases in the Bible if we start to try and interpret it as being longer periods of time.
if I could interject, I think what it could also be is that, let's just say, for argument's sake, that the universe existed with just, all the elements just floating around, doing nothing, whatever, for, let's just say it was millions of years. That wouldn't matter to us right now, because the story is about God's relationship with man and the throne that he created on earth. So therefore, in the beginning, as far as we're concerned, as far as all we need to know is when God created the earth. So that's, maybe I'm reaching, but to me, that's how it could be taken.
Well, yeah. So, see, to me, that seems like the focus of Genesis 1 is on the creation for mankind.
Right.
That's what to me seems to be the focus. Because to me, it seems like Genesis 1, the 6 days of creation, it's not talking about everything that was created. It's mostly talking about all the stuff that's related to mankind. I mean, when would you say the angels are created? It just doesn't say in Genesis 1, right?
Right.
But we do believe that they're created, right? And to me, it doesn't say when the angels are created, because that's not its focus.
Right.
Right? It's focused on God's supremacy, and it's focused on man's supremacy, right? Because what's the last thing that he does is he establishes man to have dominion over the earth and the animals and such things.
Well, the focus is also on God's creation being good and man deviating from that and bringing sin into the world, causing the world to break, and that not being the original intent. From my vantage point,
Sure.
that sets the stage for the entire Bible. God's redemption of man throughout Scripture. So to me, that's going back to, I think, if we start to bring in other interpretations that's not the literal interpretation of Genesis and add time to that, then usually, I'm not sure what old Earth view you hold, because obviously there are quite a few of them.
Sure.
But if you start bringing in death before sin, even animal death, that seems to me, that seems to kind of reduce what the results of sin. It seems to change the whole narrative to me.
Sure. Go
I
ahead.
was
Now,
kind of,
go ahead.
sorry. I was kind of curious, Adam. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:2, the earth was without form. Are you suggesting that Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2 occur at the same time, and that the beginning simply means the beginning of the first day, which is long after something else? Or are you suggesting that there's more like a time period in between 1:1 and 1:2? So God creates the heavens and the earth, and then there's 13 billion years, and then the earth was without form and void. Or not 13 billion years, I guess.
Sure.
Like
Whatever. Yeah.
9 billion years. So how are you reading the text? I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah. So I would be suggesting that, it seems like God is creating everything. Like at some finite time. So like, it's concerning the literal time frame of like, oh, it's exactly this or that. I don't hold a strong opinion or view. My biggest thing would be that, I do think that the text allows for one of those views, right? So rather it's 13, but could be 13 billion. Let's just say So like, for instance, I have a cousin, right? His view is more like a couple million years or something like that. So much more recent. And so to me or whatever, all I would really be saying is I'm more concerned with the interpretation of the text, and that I don't think that the Bible has limited it to like 6,000 years. So let's say, yes, it would be the idea that God's created all of these things, and now verse 3 is beginning of the first day of creation, which is let there be light. And God's really just ordering. He's placing his order. He's ordering the things that have already been created. It's not focused as much on material creation, I don't think, in Genesis 1:3. So that the material was already there. And so I think that when it says the earth was void and formless, and the Spirit of God, there was darkness over the surface of the waters, that's the initial conditions for the beginning of day one. Does that make more sense? I've been already accused that I haven't been clear enough on what I've said. So my other friends have been like, "Hey, you could have done a better job explaining yourself."
So you're not claiming that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is referring to the start of day one after a period of 13 billion years. You're suggesting that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth could refer to 13 billion years ago, but then verse 3 perhaps starts roughly 6,000 years ago.
Yep.
Interesting.
Does that make sense? At least that makes sense what I said. I'm not saying you agree, but
I think I understand. The reason that I was asking
Yep.
was because Clark brought up John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Mhm.
And so if you, Adam, were understanding Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, to refer to after 13 billion years of existence, during which it was without form and void, now God is beginning to create by rearranging things, then it could have made sense for someone to say that the Word was with God and the Word was God after 13 billion years, during which he was not. So I was just curious if that had anything to do with anything, but it doesn't. That's okay. Go ahead, Derek.
I think when we talk about Genesis or John 1:1, there's a difference in that what the word was, and then the word created in Genesis 1. The was in John 1:1 sounds like something that it just was. But in Genesis 1, it sounds like something was, there doesn't sound like something. There was something that was created. Now, the word created can be created, it can be formed. But yeah, that's, to me, there's a difference in the usage of what was and then what happened when you have Genesis 1:1 and John 1:1.
Wait, hold on. I'm make sure I'm following you here, Derek. So you're saying in John 1:1, it doesn't seem to be specific to creation. Is that what you're saying?
No, when you talk about was the word, in the beginning was the word, and word was with God, and word was God.
Mhm.
I'm not talking about Genesis. Excuse me. I'm not talking about John 1:3. Talking about John 1:1. And there was not a time when the word was separate from
Mhm.
God,
Mhm.
because it says was.
Mhm.
And in Genesis 1:1, it uses the word created. It didn't say in beginning was the heavens and the earth. And also, going back to the word heavens, that could just mean, the sky. I don't think it has to mean the entire universe. But that's,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So for me, I guess one of the questions that for me was important in it, I definitely know there are different answers to this, but it was the notion as well of like the angels and the created order of the angels. For me, the angels have to be created, and that has to require time, on my view. I just talked with somebody, and their argument, of course, is, well, the angels are outside of time. They were created outside of time, and therefore no time is necessary. So, but for me or whatever, no, angels have to be created. And, the question has to be asked, well, when were they created? And it seems to me that it's possible. And I'm not going to say that I feel like the text is definitive one way or another. Is it possible that they were created during the 6 days of creation? It seems to me possible. I'm not too sure. So that's just really an epistemic argument. It's not at all. I'm fully aware it doesn't convince most people or even has to. But I do think it was another consideration to me that was interesting at a minimum, because it's something that I hadn't considered concerning the idea like, well, the Bible simply doesn't say, but it's something that we all believe to be true, right? That God created the angels. Well, when did he create them? And I just think that's an open question that's not answered. So, like, let's say hypothetically, and this is, I'm not asking you to buy this one, but hypothetically, the universe existed for whatever, 3 billion years, right? And one of my friends asked, well, what was God doing all that time? Hypothetically, God could have existed, lived, and that was just harmony between God and the angels for all that time. I don't know that that's really the case. And I'm not saying I have a firm belief on that, but I'm just saying it does seem like it's like, okay, so if God existed and lived with the angels for whatever finite amount of time, and then eventually decides like, okay, now I'm going to start the next creation, the creation of mankind. I just think that it doesn't seem to me like the universe, we once found out that our planet isn't the center of the universe, and well, maybe even mankind wasn't the center of God's universe.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the geocentric, heliocentric in the outline that you provided before. I'm not sure that that's actually even really addressed in scripture, and maybe that's part of your point. I'm not sure. I was kind of curious what you mean by what you just said about how that thus being the center of the universe, our interpretation of that.
Gotcha. That was actually very unrelated to that in a sense. The notes anyway.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I didn't, I guess, mean it that way, but I think that what I would say is that I think most people interpreted the Bible to mean that the earth moves and the sun, to mean that the sun moves and the earth does not.
Mhm.
Now, none of us believe that now, right?
Right.
But
And
don't we?
it was like a big church, big
Yeah.
church belief, however many hundreds of years ago, yeah. And who was it, Tyndale, or no, someone was
Well, Galileo was one of the big ones.
Galileo, Galileo, yeah. So, and the church was trying to silence, that belief that we weren't moving, or the sun wasn't moving around us, we were moving around the sun.
Mm-hmm.
So that's okay. Yeah, so I don't actually think that scripture really takes a stance on that per se.
Well, but if you use all of the surrounding passages, the sun goes up, the sun goes down, right? And I just mean throughout the rest of scripture, right? It's always talking about the sun moving. And then this one like almost puts a nail in it and says like, well, now it really sounds like the sun is moving, right? Because the sun stood still, right? And those were the arguments from the church back then, right? If the sun stood still, it must have been moving. And
right.
so
from our vantage point, it did stop.
Mhm.
From us, how we see the sun, that it is standing still. So to me, it just doesn't really, and maybe that speaks kind of to your point, like it's not really supposed to be a scientific explanation about what the sun's doing. It's just more of a descriptor of what's happening from our vantage point.
Well, yeah, and that seemed like a very clear text. I feel like the normal plain reading of the text is that the sun stood still because it was moving.
Mm-hmm.
So that seems very intuitive to me. And the only reason, and I'll be blunt in saying for myself, the only reason I don't believe that is because of modern day science. So I will say, like, if you want to ask me, like, well, has science ever swayed your opinion on a biblical passage? That's an example for me. I've changed my view on that because of science.
I would say if we did take, I believe, everything literally as we understand it with our Western understandings, if we took everything in Genesis that way, we would be flat Earth geocentrists. But most of us aren't, and a lot of people are considered to be in a cult.
Well, that's true too. Yeah. So I am curious, like,
I'm curious if Tim has any thoughts on the.
Come on, Tim. They're trying to wait on you. They're trying to wait on you.
I'm trying to give everybody else an opportunity to speak, particularly Derek, because I know he needs to leave.
Yeah, and I need to, speaking of which, I need to go in and go.
Yeah.
And,
Derek, thanks. It was nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. And
Hit me up on Twitter.
Absolutely. I definitely enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to seeing. Will it be on YouTube?
Yeah. I'll publish this on YouTube down the road here. So.
Okay.
Tell your wife I said happy birthday.
Yeah,
I will.
Yeah. Best regards.
All right. Y'all
Nice
take
to meet
care.
you, Derek.
You too. Bye, Tim.
See you, Derek.
All right, Tim. Now you can give all the wisdom now that Derek's gone.
Well, since I've been asked, I'll say what's on my mind, and I'm not a physicist, and I'm probably gonna, if there are any physicists watching this, they're probably gonna realize how stupid I am.
Oh my goodness.
So my understanding about the Earth revolving around the sun moving, etc., is that it's really all relative, and the primary reason that the tides of thought changed back during the Renaissance on that question is because both sides were thinking about it, I think, incorrectly. Again, I could be completely wrong. I'm not a physicist. I probably don't know what I'm talking about. But what you have is, or what you had at the time, was people trying to create mathematical models for the rotation of the planets around the Earth. And they were coming up with these really complex things where the planets would go kind of like this around the Earth. And that's how, so that they would try to create these mathematical models so they could predict where Pluto was going to be, where Jupiter was going to be, assuming that everything rotated around the Earth. Well, the mathematical models were extraordinarily complex. And somebody came up with the idea of saying, well, what if we assume everything's revolving around the sun? What does the mathematical model look like then? And all of a sudden, everything was simple. Everything had an orbit like that. And it was very easy to calculate and plan and expect the planets will be in these alignments at these times and so on and so forth. So it's not so much that the planets revolve around the sun as it is that the mathematical model, based upon the initial premise of the sun as the central focal point, is simpler than the mathematical model based on the premise of the Earth as the central focal point. So I don't think either position has been proven correct or incorrect. There's just one mathematical model is a lot simpler than the other. And I could be way off the deep end here. But...
No worries. Well, yeah, but it just seems to me like, some of those things definitely influence, I guess, how I think about things, and why I do think that the Bible is just using, phenomenological language, right? It's helped me understand, like, oh, well, the Bible didn't mean that it was literally doing this way. It meant exactly what you said, Clark, right? It meant that from my perspective, that's how it appeared to me. So now, I felt like since Clark brought up death, right? I'll go ahead and say this, of course, was probably the biggest theological question for myself. All right. Now I'll say that the whole point to me is that I've changed my mind about animal death. All right. So don't throw any stones just yet. All right. But yeah, this was probably one of the largest hurdles for me. Like I said, I grew up in the Young Earth camp, right? So I grew up, Young Earth Creationism, all those things, consumed plenty of content and stuff over time. But I would say that probably the biggest thing that seemed to change my mind about this is actually like the tree of life. The tree of life to me seemed to be the primary mechanism that God had like in store and planned for Adam and Eve to live for forever. That was like kind of the plan. Like, hey, they maintain, they do what God says, they obey God, and they live forever. And it's a fairy tale story that's much shorter than our large Bible today. But the major question for me then arose of like, okay, so are we saying that everything was supposed to be immortal? But like if Adam and Eve and everything was supposed to be like immortal, then why was there a tree of life to begin with, I guess? Do you have any thoughts on that? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so you're saying that if we're all supposed to be immortal, why does immortality rely on eating from the tree of life?
Well, we don't need a tree of life. It seems like the tree of life is just kind of redundant or unnecessary.
I mean, it seems connected, at least, you know.
So like, because yeah, I am saying they're dependent on it. So
Mhm.
immortality was dependent on the tree of life. They were dependent on God's fruit.
Okay, so my vantage point is in the beginning, God has, Adam and Eve in the garden. There's a tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Mhm.
Those are unique to the garden. Um, they disobey God and eat of the fruit that they're not supposed to, and that, then sin enters the world. They, disobey God, and then that has a negative effect on them, on the animals, and on the planet itself. It curses the ground, it curses them. Um, so then that kind of, that, like I said before, broke the world.
Mhm.
So then they are kicked out of the garden so they can no longer eat from the tree of life. Um, so then, they eventually die physically. And I would probably take the stance that they died spiritually the day of, when they
Mhm.
ate. But I I guess I'm not fully understanding the question, because I think it's pretty a straightforward reading. It's pretty clear that they, immortality is dependent on the tree of life.
Right. So my question would be, do you think all of the animals depended on it as well?
I think they probably ate of it, and I think the effects of it were probably long lasting. As you could see lifespans in Old Testament before the flood were hundreds and hundreds of years. So I don't think you have to eat it every day, but
But what
I
about
think
the
it,
octopuses?
in the oceans.
Yeah.
I mean, there are four rivers that went out from the garden. So, and I think, is it Revelation that talks about the tree of life being right on, by the water? So I think it's immortal characteristics. I mean, if you want to completely go, completely literal, that I think it's possible that it's, able to spread its effects to land, sea, and air creatures.
Yeah, it just seems difficult for me to wrap my head around, I guess. That seems like too much, I guess, for me. The idea that this one tree was to feed not only Adam and Eve, but all of the animals on the planet, even if there were significantly fewer in the beginning. That's a lot. There's a lot of animals in this world.
I mean, how do
So
we know how many animals there were when God created on that first creation week, though?
yeah. Well, and I'm saying like even with a reduction of like, let's say like, yeah, okay, there's just a few population of animals and stuff like that. It's difficult to see how, because like, okay, if we talk about like human reproduction, right? We grow pretty quickly. Yeah. But then you include how rabbits, bugs, all sorts of things grow. And then not only that, but it just doesn't remind me of how what most, I don't know, plants or animals actually eat. That's not like, is was I supposed to think like all of the animals ate the same thing?
I mean, I think they're all. I don't think there was any carnivorous animals or anything before sin. I don't think there was any death. So I think everything was vegetarian from how I would view the text.
Right, right. Now the other thing to me is it just seems like I can understand believing that's the case, but it seems to me like a presupposition. I just don't see the text showing that or teaching that, I guess. The idea that you could have like zero death in the garden to me makes sense, but the garden isn't the world, right?
What about the new heaven, the new earth? Is there going to be zero death in the new earth?
I think that, yeah, I think that this is like another great illustration, right? Because a lot of people bring up, so like, are we supposed to think that the biblical passages like Isaiah 65, right? So Isaiah 65 is one of the major verses that talks about the lion will lie with the lamb and so on and so forth, right?
Well, the wolf will lie with the lamb. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, whichever one it is. Yeah, the wolf with the lamb or the lion. I don't know. There's animals that usually eat each other.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm supposed to take that passage literally as a depiction of what things will look like in the new heavens and the new earth, it also says that people will die, like human beings will die. It says it'll be a shame for the person that only dies at age 100, right? And so it doesn't make any sense to me to say, like, okay, so animals won't die, but humans will. Like, it's exactly in the same passage right under where it says the new heavens and new earth. So it's difficult for me. It seems clearly like it's talking about prophetic hyperbole, right? And not talking about something literal.
Which passage? The new heavens and new earth won't be literal, or that?
Well, that the whole thing is prophetic hyperbole. Because, well, so like, let's see. And I'm not good at, let's see. So if you look up Isaiah 65, right?
Mm-hmm.
So look at the beginning part where it says the new heavens and new earth, right at
17.
Yep, 17. 17. Right? I'll create a new heavens and new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind. Be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. I will create Jerusalem to be a delight and a joy. I'll rejoice over Jerusalem. Now it goes down to verse 20. Never again will there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his years. The one who dies at 100 will be thought a mere child. The one who fails to reach 100 will be considered accursed. So right there, it's heavily implying or suggesting or saying that humans will die. They'll just live to be really old, and that'll be blessed and blessed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's difficult for me to disassociate this verse with what it says about the animals.
Tim, do you have any thoughts on that while I'm pulling up something?
You're supposed to tag team, Tim. Be a partner, be a pal.
Yeah, I confess I don't have every passage of scripture memorized.
Dude, I'm so disappointed. That's what they told me. They told me that you had a just right here.
No. So I'm reading over Isaiah 65 at the moment. And I understand that this is about a new creation, as opposed to some kind of new creation, as opposed to the original Genesis creation. But I get your point that it seems like what we typically speak of in Christian circles is the new creation in the future, new heavens and a new earth is going to be one where there is no death. And yet here it seems in verse 20 to indicate that not only will there be death, but there will be sinners as well, and people who are cursed. And so, how do we understand that? I get your point.
Yeah.
But again, it's not directly speaking to Genesis. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have some sort of application, which is what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, and of course, I believe in a new heavens and new earth, right? I just think that one, I don't want to. Well, the argument has often been made like, okay, the new heavens and new earth, and then someone will go on to try and describe the new heavens and new earth, and the new heavens and new earth is getting back to Eden. They make this correlation. And I think that this is a bit of a mistake because they're too dissimilar, right? Like if you're going to use an analogy, they need to line up a little bit more, it seems to me. And so like, for instance, I think that some of the things that will be different in the new heavens and new earth is one, will be there mature, you could say, right? Because we'll all have lived experiences and stuff from this life. We'll be sanctified and pure and all those things. And Adam and Eve is that of immaturity, right? And I'm not saying like they're sinful, right? But they're just ignorant, right? That's part of the whole thing with the serpent is they weren't wise to the devices of him, right? But then also like I don't think, and I don't know what you guys believe about the new heavens and new earth, but I don't think there'll be children or childbearing, right? I mean, when Christ is suggesting there won't be any marriage between men or women, it seems to me like he's suggesting there won't be children. But obviously, God puts Adam and Eve in the spot to like have children. He's like, have children, be fruitful and multiply. That seems like some core differences to me, anyway. So,
Yeah,
Sure,
I'll just mention that the one standard interpretation of that text in Isaiah is that the prophet looks forward. So when he looks forward, thinking of like the new earth, he stops short and thinks of the millennial kingdom, and not, because I think Tim mentioned that there's still death, or someone did, but or no, that there's still sin, and that obviously in heaven, we know there won't be any sin. So it's, I think in Isaiah, there's, and I'm not Hebraist at all, so I would have to like really get down into like different commentaries on that passage specifically. But there are other, like in Revelation talks about the new heavens and new earth. So I think it's pretty clear that eventually, once it's created, and there's not going to be sin, there's not going to be death, it's going to be perfect essentially, and it's going to be the original creation. From my viewpoint is that it'll kind of be, that's what's modeled. So you have God created Adam and Eve in the garden, and it was not perfect in the sense that they were perfected yet, but they were in a state of no sin. There was no pain, no death, no disease, and that was good. And then they chose to disobey God, so that's what broke that model. So like God is going to redeem us back to a state of going back to what was originally created. And that, to me, that makes the most sense. But
gotcha. Yeah, to me, it seems like it won't be going back to the Garden of Eden, into that original state, but it'll be going forward into something even greater and better, I guess. And still, like, now I agree with you. Of course, I don't believe there'll be sin in heaven. I definitely think that'll be absent.
Right. So that's where I think if we both agree on that, then we can agree that what Isaiah was talking about couldn't have been the new heaven and new earth specifically. Like there's got to be some sort of something in the text that alludes to it being, because the way I was just reading about, one common interpretation of that is that he was talking about the millennial era. Even though, but yeah, I would have to study it some more. But
Sure. Well, yeah, my primary point is simply that I just think that it's prophetic hyperbole. It's not, he's not really making a literal statement of this is how animals will be and this is how humans will be. He's more so just saying like it's going to be ridiculously peaceful and it'll be ridiculously prosperous. Those are his primary points. I think that sometimes we can be a little bit too literal, and I've thought about the funny statement in English, like if you come home and you tell your wife, like, "Hey, honey, I got fired," right? And so somebody 100 years from now is reading that, and they're just like, "Oh my gosh, he got fired!" Like, and then like later on, they keep reading, and they see like, "Oh, and he seems like really downcast and like kind of hiding and stuff." It's like, oh, that's probably because he's hiding the burn marks from his face because he got fired, right? And then you're just making like reading between the lines because you're like, well, it says he got fired earlier, and now you're kind of wondering, well, why is he doing this? It's like, oh, it's probably in relation to this, right? And it's not until somebody else says, well, I'm sorry to hear you lost your job when you got fired. You're like, oh, now I know what he's talking about.
Sure.
So I just don't think that the Bible is that clear about talking about animal death. I think that those examples they're prophetically hyperbolic. He's not saying something as literal as maybe.
So if I could change things just a little bit.
Go for it.
If we're talking about Genesis 1 in particular, what would be a reason for saying that the first that there's some sort of lengthy time period between the beginning and the first day? Like even if the text can be read to allow for that, is there something in the text that tells us that's the correct reading of the text? Or is it from some other source that you're thinking that might be the correct reading of the text?
Yeah, so I do not believe. I'll put it this way: my firm belief, and I'll hold that sort of loosely, but my firm belief is that the Bible is simply ambiguous concerning age. I do not believe that the Bible says that the Earth is millions of years old or billions of years old or anything of the sort. I just don't think that it says how old the Earth is at all. Rather, it's 6,000 or other.
Okay, so you're totally open to the entire universe being 6,000 years old.
Yes, actually, I am, and in fact, I will go ahead and say that there's definitely a part of me that would love for that to be proven true. And I would perfectly say that whatever interpretation I have of the text, I will say that it is consistent with a young Earth model as far as 6,000 years old. The major details that have really changed me is that the normal straightforward readings I have come away from. So it's way more about my interpretation of what I think about the details of the text than like, oh, I'm trying to prove whatever 14 billion years, if that makes sense. So I'm willing to leave more of those discussions up to the scientists. I'm way more concerned with like, okay, how do I understand the text? How do I understand the nuances of the text? Things like that. So if I'm to be a little bit more clear, I think that Genesis 1 is a temple inauguration largely, that it's focused on that. Are you guys familiar with that terminology or?
Somewhat, but probably
Okay.
not enough to have an intelligent conversation
No
about
worries. Just wanted to try and bring, so there would be the idea that the primary focus is more about God setting up his cosmic temple in the universe. And that's the bigger purpose behind Genesis 1. And that Genesis, the days of here, days 1 through 6 are focused on God's inauguration of his temple. And on day 7, he basically finally claims it to himself, right? Because the last thing he does is set up Adam or mankind, right, as the ones to bring order to the rest of the planet. They're the ones to carry out God's commands, to be his representatives on the earth, right? And now one of the features of this, to me, would go along with what I was talking about earlier concerning verse 1 and 2, would be the idea that when we look at inaugurations, the inauguration of the tabernacle in Exodus or Numbers, oh, that's eluded me at the moment, but the inauguration of the tabernacle, when he set up the tabernacle with Moses, there's a 7-day inauguration that takes place afterwards. And then when we look at Song of Solomon's temple, right? So there's inauguration. Now the point is in both of those that the inauguration is not the building of such a thing, but it always takes place mostly after the thing is built, right? They don't inaugurate the tabernacle while they're building it. They inaugurate it once it's done to some degree. And then they set up, God is setting up he's ordering the universe, how he designs and sets his authority.
So, am I correct then in saying that you used to believe that the Bible clearly taught 6-day creation roughly 6,000 years ago, and now you believe the Bible does not clearly teach that?
That's right.
But you're not going to say that it does. You're not comfortable saying that the Earth is billions of years old, the universe is billions of years old, nor are you comfortable saying that it's 6,000 years old. You're just more like, scripture doesn't say, and that's really what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, I'm way more concerned with that question, because to me the age of the, like, if I'm gonna say that the earth is billions of years old, that's clearly to me a scientific question. Like, unless somebody can show me a passage in scripture, like, it's a scientific question. Now, I have science friends but I'm not a scientist. Okay. Like I'll talk with them about it. I'm completely a lay person on that level. And so, yeah, that's really what I would be saying is that I think that it's way more ambiguous. So my big shift for me isn't like, oh, I don't believe the earth is 6,000 years old. That's not less of my focus. My big shift for me was that, um, yeah, I don't think that it's nearly as clear that the earth is 6,000 years old. And I don't think it's
Okay.
nearly as clear that animal death wasn't permitted by the Bible. Does that make more sense? Is that more
I
clear?
I think so. I
I'm
have
gonna have to
one.
write myself a manifesto. I haven't done it. I mean, well, like I said, some of the reason I want to have this discussion is because it's relatively new compared to other conversations. Like if we wanted to sit here and talk about the Kalam cosmological argument, I've argued about that, whatever, tons of times. And I'm sure you guys have, right? You have your apologetics arguments that you're super, super familiar with. These are less familiar because I haven't had as many opportunities to argue about it.
So one thing that I wanted to address, you said that it's the age of the Earth and or universe is clearly a question for scientists or for the scientific realm.
Well, if the scriptures are open,
Sure. What about the concept of a mature creation, which I think pretty much everybody who believes that there was a literal Adam and Eve would hold that they were created in a mature state. If we were to see them walking down the street the day they were created, we'd think they were 30 or something like that.
yeah,
So if the universe were created mature, if the Earth were created mature, whatever mature means in terms of a universe and an
yeah,
Earth,
yeah.
then how would a scientist be able to determine how long it's been around? I mean, the scientists would look at Adam and say, well, he's been around for 30 years, and they'd be completely wrong. So I don't, you're seeming to indicate that it is a question for science. It's squarely in the realm of the scientific inquiry to answer that question. And I'm
Only
not
if the
really
first
sure
part's
how it could
correct.
be.
Okay, yeah. Only if the first
Yeah,
part's
sure.
correct.
So let's just say scripture doesn't even say.
Sure. Yeah.
Nevertheless, if
Yeah.
God created it in a mature state, how would science have any clue how old it is?
Sure. So this actually, I think, is a really good question, right? And the one thing I will say, Tim, you are far too polite, my friend. Just you're very polite and kind. It would be the distinction between having an appearance of age and being created mature. So let's take the example of a tree. Now, this is the only thing that I remember from school science was that I learned that when you cut down trees, they have rings, right? And so when you went and looked through the rings, then you would have some idea of when the tree began, because it would have, if it was 10 years old, it would have 10 rings. So well, I don't know, maybe Clark's the scientist. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah,
Like
roughly.
I said, I'm not, but something like this, approximately like this, right? So then if you had a tree that was 100 years old, it would have like 100 rings. So if you look at a tree and it's fully grown, you would assume on the outset that the tree is old. But if you cut the tree down and it had no rings, then it would suggest that it was born fully mature, right? So that would be like a sign of the miracle, right? So there would be a big distinction between the two.
I understand where you're going with that, but I'm not sure that something being mature can be the case without the evidence of age. The classic example is, did Adam have a belly button? I assume that he did, even though he never had an umbilical cord, because all mature 30-year-old humans have a belly button. So Adam would have had a belly button.
But did he have wrinkles?
Why wouldn't he? He would have had fingernails, which are, I believe, dead cells. He would have had hair, which I believe is dead cells. I don't see why he wouldn't have had wrinkles. If he was 30, I mean, if he was 20, maybe he wouldn't have had wrinkles. So, to me, the maturity and quote appearance of age go along together. The phrase appearance of age is, I think, it kind of skews the conversation, I think, into suggesting that when we think that something looks a certain age, we're right.
Mm-hmm.
And we just kind of make that stuff up as we go. I meet somebody who tells me he's 30. I meet somebody else who tells me he's 30, and I start to develop an idea of what it looks like to be 30. And so then if I meet somebody else and I think he looks like a 30-year-old, I'm going to say, oh, he looks like he's 30. And if God then tells me, no, I just met him yesterday, then it's not, well, God, you lied to me. It's
Yeah.
man, I apparently don't know what it means to be 30, what that looks like.
Yeah.
I've come to wrong conclusions. So it's not that God created an appearance of age, it's that I've decided that is an appearance of age, and I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, and this is the concern, right? The concern is for what I call, deceiver God arguments. There are several different variations, but this is exactly like an example. That's the concern, is that I assume that we would agree that God doesn't deceive us, right? Maybe. I mean, I get it. I get it that, yeah, we can put the caveat that God does things that we don't understand and we get things wrong, right? So I'm not.
Well, so I'm a divine determinist. I would argue that God causes us to be deceived, but God does not lie. God
Okay.
never does it directly. It's always through some sort of alternative created entity that does it.
Yeah. I think because I checked out your website and stuff. So you're in the precept camp, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Clark too? I don't know Clark's background as much.
I kind of take a cumulative case stance, so I kind of draw from all different apologetic.
Well, let me ask you this: Are you a Calvinist, Clark? Or
No.
Okay.
But
we
I'm
should
not
debate.
Armenian either.
No worries. And just for clarity, so I'm a Molinist, so I'm
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not
closer to Molinism, but I'm not a Molinist either.
Fair. Yeah, okay. So yeah, divine determinist, God deceives us. Okay.
So I think what you're getting at though, so like when God created, if it was, a literal 6-day creation, you're saying you don't believe God would deceive us and purposely deceive us. So one argument for like a deceiver God argument would be, even though it was a 6-day creation week, God created a bunch of fossils in the ground.
Yeah.
So you would say that would be a deceitful thing to do. You wouldn't categorize God as being, that would be uncharacteristic of God to do something like that.
That would be.
I would agree with that. I'm not sure where Tim would stand on that. I would agree that I don't think before death existed, God would be placing fossils in the ground. I don't think that God would do that.
So I understand what you guys are saying. I'm not completely sure, again, what a mature Earth would look like. If fossils are necessary for, say, for example, fossil fuels, and if God wants us to have access to fossil fuels, then he might put fossils in the ground so that we can have fossil fuels. And we might look at those fossils and say, this thing must have been alive. Why would we say that? Like we're just wrong. We're just coming to the wrong conclusion. It's not because God lied to us. It's because we're stupid. I'm not saying that is what happened.
Sure.
I'm not saying that.
Yeah, well, at least you do understand. Yeah, that's the concern from many of the others on the other side, is that we find this to be highly implausible, that God characteristically does not seem like he would do something like this. So to use another slightly different example, because it fits a little bit more with what you're talking about, in that God created everything, right? So I would say that, look, when God does a miracle, he doesn't erase the evidence that he performed a miracle. Now, that might sound a little bit peculiar in one way, but let's imagine you had a medical miracle. Well, he doesn't go and delete the documents of the prior condition, right? Or he doesn't try and clean it up, right? And it's like when we look at the resurrection of Christ, we go, he doesn't. It's like, oh, and then as soon as God resurrected Christ, he put a body there to make sure that it's like, well, no, we would then be very suspicious. Like, okay, God, so you performed a miracle, you raised him from the dead, but you left his body there. Like, well, no, like there's evidence. What's the evidence? There's no body. That's the evidence, right? So yeah, that would to me be like examples of like how I would think about some of these that otherwise like it definitely seems difficult for me. Well, okay, I'll go into the next kind of deceiver God argument that's related to this though. Now Clark mentioned like the fall of the animals. He believes that essentially three things changed, and it was man, the earth, and the animals. I just don't see any reason as much for the animal one. It seems to me like animals pretty much stayed the same. Like that, they don't seem to be mentioned in the fall. So if animals didn't change, or they did, I don't know. Are you like suggesting some sort of rapid evolutionary biological change, or are you vying for a second, I don't know, move of creation at the fall? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think it. I don't know if it necessarily would have to be immediate, or that they just start to devolve into, or kind of go into this state of like killing each other. And I don't know if it would have been like that second they just start killing each other and they're carnivorous, or it's kind of a gradual thing. But I think that's when the initial, when it says that that's when sin entered the world, their death because of sin. It doesn't say human death; it just says death because of sin. I believe that's New Testament. I'd have to look at that, but I'm
No,
sure
I
you
think I think Romans 5 does say human death though. I think it
does
is
it?
focused around mankind. Yeah. Death
I think it just says death.
comes
I
through
don't think it
Adam.
says.
Well, it said death comes through Adam and everything because, all
It
men
doesn't say
sinned.
human death comes through Adam. It says death comes through Adam.
Right. But the context is clearly humans, right? All because it says death through all people because all sinned, right? So it's talking about sin and death. That what because what the wages of sin is death, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's connecting the death as a result of sin. All die because all have sinned. But I
Yeah,
just don't think there's
but
any connection with animals
um,
because animals aren't moral agents, right?
Why wouldn't animals be moral agents?
Well, Tibby, you won't like this answer because humans won't have this either, but because they don't have free will to some degree, they don't seem to do. They don't do what they shouldn't do. They just do what they naturally do.
So do you think that the serpent was a moral agent, or Balaam's donkey? Do you think that either of them were moral agents?
I don't believe that the donkey was, and I don't. You're gonna hate me for this one. The serpent is just Satan. Like I don't believe that the serpent's an animal.
well, what was the curse on the serpent then?
It's a curse on Satan.
So Satan has to crawl on his belly the rest of his existence?
No, it's just hyperbolic language, talking about just like I used my example of being fired. It's a act of humiliation and the stuff like that. It's not really talking about, I don't think, anything biological or something like that. It's talking about like utter humiliation. If I say Hitler is scum, well, I don't, when someone says no, he's not, he's a man. Well, they're not really confused about that.
Is it hyperbolic language for the curse on the earth, would you say?
Um, not exactly. I think it's a curse on the earth. Yeah. So it's talking about, well, see, I don't see it's cursing the serpent and it's cursing the earth, right? Those are the two curses that are mentioned and listed. So like 3:14, right, is cursed are you above all the beasts of the field, right? So it's cursing Satan.
Well, there's also childbearing.
Yeah, but there's no curse mentioned there.
Well, no, yeah, not a curse, but yeah, you will now, yeah.
Yeah, it'll increase your pain in childbearing, right? Now, I'm curious about that one as well, right? Then isn't there pain before the fall if God is only increasing her pain?
Um,
Because if he's increasing something, then it has to be something that was there prior.
Was there childbearing before the fall?
Well, there wasn't any that had happened yet. It doesn't appear to be anyway. But it does seem like it's like the potential was that was the initial plan though, right?
Well, I don't know. Was the initial plan to populate the earth before the fall, or was it after the fall?
Well, it's Genesis 1, right? Be fruitful and multiply, therefore
Mhm.
fill the earth and subdue it.
It was at before the
Genesis
fall.
1:26, maybe.
6.
So that's, yeah, early.
No, that was whenever God said, "Let us make man in our image."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Keep going. Maybe 28. Maybe 28.
Yeah.
Yeah, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Yep. Okay, yeah. So that would be before the fall.
So on these questions of were the days good? What does good mean? Was there any kind of death before the fall, animal death? I understand the common perspective in the YEC circles.
In the what?
In the YEC,
Oh, okay.
Young Earth
Got it.
Creationist circles.
Yeah. Got it.
And I hesitate to object to it because I'm not convinced that it's incorrect. But in terms of the days being good, in particular, I would tend to interpret that just to mean that they turned out the way that God intended them to turn out. The things that He created were they were created the way that He wanted them created. They were what He was intending. And I would add to that God intended permanently intended for man to fall, and man did fall. So in the same way that the days were good, man's fall was also good. It turned out the way that God wanted it to. In other words, I'm not understanding the word good in Genesis 1 to be referring to something that is not immoral. Rather, I'm understanding it to be something that was the way that God planned it. It fit His causal plan, rather than His prescriptive plan. And so if it fit His causal plan, and if His causal plan involved Adam falling and Christ saving everyone or saving the elect, then there's no suggestion that there couldn't have been things like pain at the beginning.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's what it seems to me, yeah, reasonable to have some of that. Well, and also, go ahead, Clark.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I just looked up that verse. So you're right. It was actually it was Genesis 3:16. No, this is a different one. So this is to the woman, He said, "I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth." So multiply, the Hebrew word is rabba. So there obviously transliteration, there's a bunch of different meanings for
Sure.
what that would be. So the initial meaning would be or become great, be or become many, be or become much, be or become numerous. So it's not really something that exists and then it's going to be more on that. It's becoming that. So I don't necessarily, and I'm no Hebraist, so I could be way off the mark.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, yeah. I'm very studied actually on 3:16. I'm actually working on writing a book on that chapter or that verse. But yeah, no, that's fine. That's cool. That's yeah. But yeah, either way or whatever, it seems to me like, again, like it seems to me the primary mechanism of the immortality of Adam and Eve is the it's the tree of life. And it's not the notion of like pain is impossible. Like I don't think that Adam was a Superman. Like if before the fall Adam was to descend and launch himself onto the sun, I don't think he survives this. But I do think that it is exactly the notion of, and honestly, I feel like this is the consistent theme throughout scripture, right? If you abide in me, if Adam stays and obeys God's commands, yeah, he will live and prosper and not be harmed and all of those things. It's kind of just that, I mean, to me, honestly, it's our everyday experience as Christians. Like, hey, guess what? Follow my commands and do what I say, and it will be well with you. And I think it's exactly that command. And so it's not that Adam's a Superman. It's that he, as long as he obeys God and follows what the Lord has intended for him, yeah, he'll be fine, and they'll have a great life together. But he had to go and mess it up for us. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, I don't know if yeah, I would probably agree that if Adam were launched into the sun, he's not a Superman, he would burn up. But I think my analogy would be Adam wouldn't be able to launch himself into the sun pre-fall. I don't think,
Is that because of the lack of technology, or?
no, just like in any sense, I don't think because we were in that state of goodness, that of the way God intended, I don't think pain was a possibility. God was sustaining his creation in a way that pain wouldn't be a possibility. So it doesn't mean that we were supermen before the fall. Just means that that's the pain wasn't possible. We wouldn't stub our toe because we were or cut ourselves or whatever, because that's the nature of how God created. That's the state of which God created us in. And I don't know, maybe Tim might disagree with me there, but
No, well, it didn't happen.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good one. I'm pretty
it's
sure
not
you're
gonna
right
happen.
about that. Yeah.
And it's not going to happen, and it's not happening now. So there's no scenario in which it could happen, since it didn't, won't, and isn't. It can't. So I guess in that sense, I agree with you. This might determine but another thing to consider is the concept of the federal headship of man over creation.
Yeah.
And the idea that creation is subject to man. In Genesis 1, it seems to make that pretty clear.
I'm a firm believer in that one.
And so if man is fallen and creation is following fallen man, subject to fallen man, in obedience to fallen man, then creation is also in a bad state. And that would include animals. And so that's sort of, I guess, you can immediately see that from a relational perspective. If your leader is going the wrong way, then God is unhappy with everybody that's following him. But you can also, from a different perspective, when we look at the earth groaning and the thorns and thistles growing, and how it's going to be hard for Adam to grow anything that he can actually eat, that would seem to indicate it's also going to be hard for vegetarian animals to eat anything. Or at least more difficult. They're going to have less nutritious food as a result of the earth being cursed. And so you'd have a biological change in animals. They'll be weaker. They'll be, I don't know exactly how it's going to be different, but and then after the flood, of course, that like totally transforms the entire environment. And anyway, things change just as a result of the earth being cursed, the leader going the wrong way, and the flood. And some of those things would have to impact animals in a pretty extreme way, I would think.
I would agree that I do think that there can certainly be some changes. I'm not too convinced, though, that it would have literally changed the very nature of animals themselves. So, like, for instance, let's take scorpions, right? Like, in the idea that it's like, are we saying that scorpions didn't have tails that stung things? Or all of the mechanisms that we look at of creation now, I look at as beautiful, meticulous, incredible designs of God. And I tend to think a little bit more along the lines of what you're talking about, that, hey, what God ordered and declares to be good is because it is for his purposes, right? So if he intends for flies to be food for frogs, it is therefore good, because that is in its intended purpose. And so and it doesn't seem to me like there's any significant talk of a change in relation with animals to each other. Although you bring up some interesting points concerning food, like if there's a reduction in available food for animals, then it could lead to that. But a lot of animals, when they have predation against each other, it seems very natural. And I don't know, it seems to me like I shouldn't conclude that animals eating each other or killing each other is a result of sin. Rather, I conclude it's a result of design.
And I would argue that it could be both and.
So
But
I'm just curious, Adam. So whenever God brought all the animals to Adam to be named, were they dangerous for Adam to be around, or I'm just curious your view on that.
Yeah, so this actually I think is a great question, right? Because to me the major difference that I do see in the Bible is I see a shift between animals and man. And that shift does occur during the flood, right after Noah and the flood. Then God says to Noah, "Hey, now I give you the animals to eat just as I gave you the plants," right? So we do see a dietary shift that God specifically mentions for mankind. So it does seem to me, and he specifically says, like, now animals will scurry and run from fear from you, right? So there's a change in relationship that God mentions between man and animals, but I don't see one that occurs between animals and animals. So it does seem to me like, no, it could be that man had a very peaceful relationship with animals. But I'm not so sure, because honestly, the other major thing that he mentions concerning the part with Noah, right, is he mentions that man is made in God's image. Therefore, right, anyone who kills another man, they shall be put to death, right? And so he's making a bigger deal like, hey, look, we're man, these are animals, right? God was not, he was not vegan, right? God was not like, here's animals and man, they're right here together, right? He's like, no, no, no. Like if an animal kills a man, like, that's not okay, right? There's a big difference between the two. And so I think that God obviously elevates mankind, and there was a relationship that sure was much closer in the garden, but was separated after the events with Noah.
now, have you said over the course of this conversation both that animals don't sin and that it is not okay for an animal to kill a human?
Yeah.
Would it be sin for an animal to kill a human if it's not
No.
okay for an animal to do that? Why not?
No.
How is that not sin?
Well, because now going back to your illustration of just fallen nature and stuff like that, because I don't think animals are just doing what's natural, right? So, but it was man's job to, back going to dominion, right? It's man's job to orchestrate, organize, and bring everything under his dominion.
Have you ever had a dog, or are you a pet owner?
I'm not a pet owner. I mean, it's not like I've never had any pets or anything like that, but
I think to me, it's pretty clear that there are a lot of different animals even today that they have a sense of right and wrong. Like a dog can know it's beyond primal. It goes beyond primal. They can love, they can feel joy, they can feel depression. They can make choices that they know are right and wrong, not to the level of mankind. And I think definitely unique in the sense that we can know God and have a relationship with Him. I don't necessarily believe an animal can or can't do that. I don't know, but I would say that animals, can make moral decisions probably.
so I am curious then. Now, because I have heard other people kind of espouse this, so I'm very curious to hear you guys' responses because I haven't got to talk too much about on this subject. So both of you would espouse that animals have moral agency then? Would that be the idea? Or would you say it differently?
I would probably agree that they do, not to the level of mankind, but I
Mhm.
think to some level that certain animals do show evidence that they do have some moral agency.
Yeah, I think I would be inclined to say yes.
Okay.
I'm not super adamant about it, but
Sure.
if I meet somebody like you who says that they don't, I'm going to challenge that.
Well, I'm interested to have this little part here and stuff. So would you say then that animals are punished by God?
I think that that's certainly possible.
And so would you also say that then God redeems animals through Christ?
I think
Um,
some animals will go to heaven. Yes, I think you will see some animals in heaven personally.
And some to damnation?
I'm not sure. I don't know what the criteria would be because the Bible's a book for mankind's redemption. I'm not sure how animals, or even if they need redeeming, because it's mankind's, kind of like Tim was saying, as the head of creation, we are the reason for the fall. So it's our responsibility for ourselves to accept Christ and to be redeemed. But I'm not sure, if there would be animals in hell. I definitely think there's evidence that they're moral agents, that they make, you know decisions for themselves. They can feel, pain. They can feel emotions. So you know, that's my view.
Interesting.
yeah, I don't think scripture is clear on animals going to heaven or hell, or uh, how they would get to either place, what their responsibilities are before God, and how God deals with violations of those responsibilities. Um, but I do think that the passage we were talking about in Genesis, with animals killing humans, um, I I think that that makes it clear that there is a moral obligation on animals. There's two ways of reading that text that I'm familiar with. One of them is basically makes it sound as though if an animal kills a human, then the animal has done something immoral, and the other one makes it sound as though if anyone kills a human, then everyone needs to uh, deal with that, even the animals. Um, in other words, like, let's say that I murder you, Adam.
Let's not do
Your
that.
your dog ought to attack me, because it's your dog's responsibility to make sure that I don't get set free, that I shed my blood because I shed your blood. Um, so those are the two ways of reading it. Either way, though, the two ways that I'm familiar with, at least,
Mhm.
either way would seem to place some kind of moral obligation on animals. Don't kill humans or avenge your dead humans.
Gotcha. Yeah. I just don't. Yeah, I don't think that animals have. Yeah, moral responsibility. Yeah. I mean, I definitely hear what you guys are saying, and it also seems difficult for me to. It's like, yeah, exactly. Like, okay, so what are we saying? There's redemption. I mean, and honestly, I kind of joke about it, but it's like, is that what the serpent on the pole was all about? Moses was saving the animals in the wilderness. Remember when he lifts up the staff? Do you not remember that story?
I do. I'm not sure what you're talking about with
Well, yeah,
respect
it was
to
that was
this
that the
narrative, though.
redemptrix moment when Moses was saving the animals.
Oh,
See,
okay,
there's a
so that like the
serpent.
snake
Yeah,
dies
it's the
for everybody.
representative. He's the representative for animal kind. Animals got saved before we did because their savior came first. I don't know. I'm just that's the only
Yeah,
thing that
I'm
I can
familiar with
think
it.
of that reminds me of the scenario. But
I mean, I think it kind of goes along the same. Like, obviously, science has shown that the universe is a pretty big place, and do you think personally that there might be other planets that have intelligent life on them?
yeah, I call them angels, but you can call them something else
Okay,
if you want.
so you don't think God, other than creating in the physical world, you don't think uh, there's a possibility that other planets have physical beings inhabiting them?
Theoretically, it's possible. Personally, I don't believe that.
Yeah.
I literally, I mostly just stick to, and I do. I'm more on the side of it's like, yeah, there's aliens. They're called angels. They do stuff. I mean, because honestly, like the angels answer most of the questions that you would want to know. It's like, hey, is there another species or is there another set of beings? Yes.
Mm.
What did they do with sin and moral responsibility? Well, they fell. How does God interact with them? Well, yeah, there's kind of a conflict between the two. How do they interact with us? Well, they interact with us through, possession and temptation and a whole variety of ways. Well, what's going to happen to them ultimately? Ultimately, they'll be damned by God and judgment and stuff like that. So it's like, yeah, well, we have another subset of beings that are out there, and I think God answers most of the questions concerning those beings.
Yeah, I
On
think Hugh
Earth.
Ross takes a similar stance on most like extraterrestrial encounters that probably explained by fallen angels, if I remember correctly. And I would probably agree. I think a lot of throughout human history, a lot of what could be categorized as extraterrestrial encounters could be explained by angels or demons. But I also, my point is, I wouldn't rule out a planet possibly being inhabited by intelligence or life, as a part of God's creation, just because it's not mentioned in the Bible. God, the point of the Bible is God's redemption of mankind, and what we're supposed to, our responsibility, in that story. So I don't think because it's not mentioned that there is no extraterrestrial life on other planets. So I think that it's possible, but similar with animals, I don't think because we don't understand how that redemption works for animals. I wouldn't throw it out.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yep. So let's see here. I think there was at least one other major thing that I had sent you that I was curious about. I'm trying to think. Well, I don't know. There's one other thing I'm particularly curious about. Is most of what I've espoused to you today fairly foreign? And I know this is not like your guys' core subject, but yeah, I don't think there are too many of me around. But
No, I'm familiar with most of what we talked about.
good.
It's been a while since I really got down and discussed YEC, OEC with somebody, but for the most part, for me, it was
Well, and so one of the things I really want to do or figure out a way sort of in the future is that I hate that the discussion is broken up into YEC, OEC, right? Young Earth creationism and old Earth creationism. Because to me, if somebody tells me I'm an old Earth creationist, I have no idea what you think about the Bible. It doesn't tell me anything, right? I don't know. Do you believe in the gap theory? Do you believe the gap is between 1 and 2? Do you believe it's day 4? I have no idea what you believe. It tells me nothing. Like, okay, great, you're an old Earth creationist. All I know is that you believe that science has said that the Earth is billions or millions of years old. That's all I know, right? I have no idea if you believe in animal death. I have no idea if you believe in evolution. Like, none of those things are at all clear to me, right? The only one that is a little more clear is young Earth creationism. It's a little more clear, like, all right, I have some idea, right? But again, if somebody says they're a theistic evolutionist, I don't know what they think about Genesis 1. Like the question is super up in the air. So I would love it if there was some way in the future that things were more focused on one's theological views on the passages. So like, for instance, yeah, I try and go with a temple inauguration view is what I have basically expressed and stuff. And that says a whole lot more about like, if I say that, you can go like, okay, I have a much better idea of what you're thinking concerning certain passages. So
now the way that you described temple inauguration,
yeah,
I didn't hear anything that necessitated old Earth.
it does not.
Okay.
No, and this would actually be something that, yeah, you could adopt a temple inauguration and still be a young Earth creationist. And I mean, I encourage like anyone that wants to be a young Earth creationist, like, hey, look, you can look into that and be like, hey, look, yeah, I like this, and I'm still a young Earth creationist. Again, to me, that's one of the reasons that I want to be way more focused on what's the Bible say, rather than how old is the Earth. Because to me, if you frame the question on how old is the Earth, well, then to me, it asks a partially scientific question at a minimum, right? Because if it's just, well, the Bible says young Earth creationism, well, I don't think it's possible to come away reading the Bible and somebody go, oh, after I read the Bible, then I knew the Earth was 14 billion years old. It's just not a hermeneutic you can adopt. Like it's not possible, right? I guarantee that even Hugh Ross, who read the Bible and says, he's like, oh, I didn't see the young Earth creationist view in there. He didn't walk away and write his 14 billion year old idea. So I'm perfectly happy in saying like, hey, maybe the age of the Earth is 6,000 years old, and if somebody wants to prove that and show that, then I'm all for it. So, but concerning, some of these other issues, and which is why I kind of frame it that way, it's like, I'm way looser on, could there have been animal death before the fall? I think there could have been animal death between animals, right? It's like, oh, that makes sense to me. And again, with the tree of life, it's like, well, yeah, the tree of life seems to be, again, it seems to me to be for Adam and Eve, like, if animals eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what happens? Is something supposed to occur? I don't know. I don't think the Bible says anything, because that's not the point. So yeah, that's largely some of my points about this. And then part of my other major thing is, hey, I just don't want young earthers stoning old earth creationists. That's all. Like I want to be a little bit ecumenical to some degree, and even be able to talk with theological determinists. So you guys can
I
repent
agree.
later. No, I'm just
I'm a fan of Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham. One thing I differ a little bit on is how dogmatically they they treat old earthers. So I get where they're coming from, and I think it is a big issue. The whole, like I said, the big what matters most is, for me, is death before sin, and death,
Mhm.
pain, disease before sin. Not even just in humans, but that's I can agree to disagree. I think we all can have these conversations, and that's a good thing.
Have you ruled us all as heretics yet, Tim?
No, not at all. I tend to be pretty easygoing about Christians disagreeing with me on things. And on this particular topic, like, Clark reiterated that his perspective, that the most important thing here has to do with the death before the fall.
Mhm.
And I'll reiterate that mine has to do with understanding scripture.
Mhm.
And to cast that in a slightly different light than I did earlier, lots and lots of people leave Christianity, the tradition that they're raised in, because they understand Genesis to say 6 days, and then the scientific community promotes this idea that it's 14 billion years old. And so obviously, Adam, you respond to that your way, but since so many people seem to read it naturally as a 6-day creation event,
Mhm.
often people are not convinced that reading it differently is even reasonable. And so I understand there's sort of two extremes here. The people who think reading it differently isn't reasonable are young earth creationists and atheists. Um, but given that so many people do leave the church because they think it can't be read differently and become atheists, and given that the Big Bang Theory was developed by a Christian, who believed the Bible, at least in some sense, you would think that they would be aware that some Christians don't hold to a young earth creationist position. And if they're aware that not all Christians hold to a young earth creationist position, and they're being raised in a Christian household, and they're seeing that evolution or Big Bang is true or whatever, because that's what they're taught at school, and they're still rejecting Christianity and the scriptures, even though they know that some Christians don't agree with the young earth interpretation. I mean, either they're just really reprobate, which could totally be the case, or the idea that it can be read differently isn't particularly convincing.
Mhm.
And I think from my perspective, the idea that it can be read differently easily isn't really convincing to me.
Mhm.
But I do understand that that's just me. That's my perspective. I read it the way that I read it, and it seems to say this, and other people read it differently, and I get that. So
Well, don't
anyway,
worry, Tim. Yeah, I get the sense that you are a bit of a stubborn person. Uh, yeah, I know. Your wife didn't phone ahead and tell us that, but yeah. So I think that one of the major things to me is I think it's really great to be able to have, and honestly, like just looking at your guys' entire theologetics group and stuff like that, you guys seem a little bit diverse, you know. So I think that you, to some degree, you guys are exactly in that realm of like, okay, you can have some dissension over some things, but at the end of the day, I think that it still has to be about, hey, we can still minister and preach Christ together, you know. And so it's too big of a lump to me for some who want to make this a dividing issue. You know, I have friends on way more other diverse issues than this that yeah, it's difficult sometimes to decide where you want to draw the lines. But for me, this isn't one of the ones, and I totally get it. And I'll say it this way, right? I was having a difficult time for a minute trying to understand, like, dude, how do we work out things where we have all these different views, you know? And my only conclusion is that you just have to continue to argue and fight for them, you know? Like, hey, you're convinced that this is true? All right, well, let's talk about it and argue and fight about it and disagree. Because you know what? I will say that many of my friends, yeah, they have changed my mind on different things, you know, and they have showed me like, you know, whatever. The Bible is like, oh no, but the Bible's actually saying this, and it's like, oh, now I understand. So yeah. So one, I just really appreciate you guys coming out to yeah have this conversation with me. And I hope it was at least a little bit enjoyable and stuff. Didn't hold you guys hostage too much, but yeah. And yeah, I don't know. I really appreciate you guys. It's been great chatting and stuff. Any last words?
Yeah, thanks for the discussion.
yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. And yeah, you guys want to learn more about their ministries and stuff? I'm sure I'll have your guys' links in the description below.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys.